Hello, and welcome to the CDO Magazine interview series. I am Kellie De Leon with Treasure Data, and we are partnering with CDO Magazine, MIT CDO IQ, and the International Society of Chief Data Officers in a series of interviews. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Ghadi Hobeika, Managing Partner at Artefact. Welcome.
Thank you, Kelly.
I've seen you use kind of these terms, kind of crawl, walk, run, or crawlers, walkers, and runners when it
Mhm.
comes to thinking about where clients are at on their data maturity spectrum. And I would bet that also kind of relates to this conversation about where folks are at, even in their own, data strategy and first party data strategy. Just wondering if you could kind of talk us through those three levels. How do you define crawl, walk, and run in terms of data maturity?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's a simple and quick way to assess that when I come to an organization. I typically look at three things. I look at how many analytical talent does the organization have, right? Data analysts, data engineers, data scientists, and people around these groups. Number two, I look at the number of use cases or data-driven programs that are running internally. And number three, I look at the type of analytics that's being used. Is it more descriptive? Is it more predictive? Is it more advanced and prescriptive, right? So, for instance, an organization with marketing and finance as the heavy users of a very manual and reporting type of analytics programs, I would place on the lower end of the scale, whereas when I look at other organizations where sales, supply chain, even HR have advanced analytical practices, when you can find some predictive and even prescriptive use cases, I would tend to rank on the highest end of the curve. So that's sort of an easy way to look at it and to get a first feeling. But after looking at that, you can obviously look into more detail. And we have detailed frameworks to do that. We look at literally three pillars. We look at data readiness. So the tooling, the technology, the compliance, the quality of the data that's being fed. We look at business readiness, which is more the strategy, the programs, the demand management processes, like everything that's more on the business side to run and develop those programs at scale. And I think we also look at people readiness, and people readiness is really important. It's the talent, it's the skills, it's the ways of working, it's the data savviness as a general organization, the way decisions are made, and things of that sort. So what I tend to see is that historically organization would get their technology pillar right or their readiness pillar right, even if sometimes they tend to start with the use cases themselves. But now the next focus, or at least from what I'm seeing, is the people pillar. Like data will be about the people, and it will be the only way to scale.
It's such a huge change management challenge. I think, when you think about that, the way you were talking about kind of the ramp up along the spectrum resonates with me a lot. We talk a lot about, obviously in CDP land, the kind of core use cases are usually thought of as marketing use cases, and historically marketers are the ones who've wanted CDPs, owned the budget, been driving that and thinking about using CDP for personalization and segmentation and, driving, better marketing efficiency, that sort of thing. But where we see the value of customer data and the value of a customer data platform really become exponential in a business is when it starts to expand beyond marketing, with the next steps more likely being into customer service, sales, but then, as you alluded to, even beyond that, starting to think about logistics and product innovation and all of these other things around demand planning that you could use customer data for to improve not only customer experience and all of the things that kind of drive revenue, but also internally to drive things like
Absolutely.
analytics and insights that can drive operational efficiencies and sort of better business decisions and better business transformation. But all of that takes, quite a bit of people coordination to think about how to really get the value of customer data across an entire, organization. That's definitely a different challenge. I would imagine, though, that it's one that you really like to sort of evangelize and talk about how to expand that data. I'm wondering if you can sort of talk about how you might explain or position why it's important for brands to go from that crawl and walk stage where they're still getting, value out of their data. Like, what is the value of really getting way up to that run level of maturity? Why should businesses invest the time and people and change management into getting there?
Yeah, it's a really good question because sometimes you jump on a program and you start investing money and you're not even sure why you did it in the first place. But listen, the good news is there are multiple studies, either by consulting firms or research institutes, that have demonstrated over and over again that higher data maturity is directly correlated to higher business performance. And there are multiple reasons behind that. Usually, the people that are advanced in the data analytics field tend to outperform their peers in terms of faster access to insights, faster decision making, higher customer centricity as a whole. And also, and maybe even more importantly, and back to our talent discussion, they're often able to attract the best talent because people love these companies because of the sophistication of their programs and the level of advancement, but also because it also transcribes or translates into a more maybe modern data-driven culture and less political or less legacy-based, which sort of the more junior, younger talent tend to love. So I think that data savviness is definitely and truly a competitive advantage because of those many reasons and maybe more. So even if sometimes it's hard to calculate or predict or accurately estimate the ROI of a data initiative, I think that long term it's a great investment. Parts of that are easier to sort of figure out, like the CDP, as you just mentioned, is a very sort of direct indicator of delivering better economic performance. Your marketing tends to improve, your media dollars pay more, your 1P data is easily valued. But as you start getting bigger and bigger, or into sort of some areas like data governance or data management, it becomes a little bit trickier. I just think that it's both a leap of faith, just understanding that it's important, but it's also been demonstrated economically. So more data and analytics, usually better performance.
I think it's spot on that there are going to be some places where you can look at the data and show an ROI on some projects like this, and then there's going to be some others where it is more anecdotal. I think it's a really interesting point that you make about attracting talent and really, what being a data-driven organization can do. I think a lot of people think about that in terms of revenue or operational efficiency, but I think the point about talent is a really important one in the age that we live in now, and the fight for good talent. So that's a great point. Shifting gears a little bit, but kind of touching on something that you were just mentioning, data governance. Obviously brands want to deliver as much value as they can to customers. We were just talking about that kind of two-way, trust relationship exchange, but it can be difficult with data privacy on the top mind for consumers, and this sort of like, how do we navigate all of that? And data governance is what really sits in the middle of respecting, consumer wishes, but finding the right and best and most expansive ways to use data, to drive organizations forward. So data governance, I think, is a really critical area that companies need to be on the cutting edge for, or cutting edge of. And, we certainly saw that the pandemic made it a requirement, to really accelerate data maturity for many organizations. Wherever you are at on the maturity curve, the pandemic made you hurry up and get, further along from where you were. But I think as that digital transformation accelerated, many companies were unprepared for the data governance requirements and needs that were going to come alongside that digital transformation in order to make sure that they're safeguarding data, properly, as well as obviously being compliant with, regulations, which are seemingly always changing and getting more and more complex. So I'm just curious from your perspective, how are you seeing companies and in particular, C-suite and leaders
Mhm.
responding to this data governance challenge?
Yeah, it's a super interesting question because that has been really on trend and I witnessed exactly the same thing over the last 24 months or so, maybe a little bit more. What happened before that is that companies would venture into data transformation programs, do POCs, get some interesting results from that and try to scale. And they would really literally fail at the scaling point because data was not ready, right? So over the last 2 years or so, a number of huge data governance programs have been launched on the market in the marketplace. Obviously, some sectors were a little bit more in advance because of regulatory constraints. I'm thinking of banking, I'm thinking of healthcare. But today, everybody's playing the game and everybody's trying to catch up. And it's driven by two things. You're right, the digital acceleration and transformation of companies. And as you, I think, alluded to as well, regulation, right? GDPR first, and then CCPA, and now CPRA. So it's just like getting into the way of we have to comply. So I think just as like data maturity, you have different levels of advancements across the market. We tend to usually describe governance as defensive and offensive. To me, defensive governance is about data compliance, IT security. The goal here is to preserve brand reputation, to reduce financial exposure. I think most companies are sort of getting there, if not already there, but it's going to be an ongoing trend no matter what because of regulation continuing to evolve. Now, the offensive side of it is the most interesting one, and I think this is where you start sort of weaponizing your data programs with high quality, highly accessible data, which is qualitative, which is documented, which is clean, compliant. And this is where your programs, your use cases, your tooling and technology are going to make an impact, right? It's where you can scale easily. It's when you have trust in the data. It's where the results that come out can hardly be challenged because everyone agrees that the data was just good in the first place. So as these programs expand, the interesting part as well is seeing like how they're sponsored and how they're funded because they're usually big, expensive, and long-term programs. And I've seen more and more C-level sponsorship, direct C-level sponsorship. It was maybe historically the home of the CDO or the CIO, and I've seen more and more CFOs getting into the game because they're sort of the neutral party, really interested in data quality overall and accessibility overall for their own sake, but also for the sake of the enterprise as a whole. And in some cases, and even in very large organizations, I've seen the CEO himself just helping his chief data governance officer or his chief data officer enforcing those programs and getting not only IT and the data teams ready for it, but also the business teams lined up to participate and collaborate. So it's been really on the radar of the C-level, and it's a growing trend.
That's really interesting and kind of mirrors something that we have seen both anecdotally and from some research that we just recently conducted, which, again, CDP has kind of historically been seen as being driven more by marketing use cases. But we're seeing more and more people saying, that what's driving their CDP requirements or their CDP, purchase selection is oftentimes getting much more higher ranking around things like security and data governance and all of these compliance issues. And so it's interesting to think about who is in that decision process, and maybe it even means that marketers can go to their other friends in the C-suite and then try to store up a little bit of money and time and commitment and executive sponsorship to get these really important use cases and programs moving.
I completely agree. And listen, I think what's interesting with CDP specifically is that, yes, it's mainly today, I would say, a marketing tool, but it's expanding, or it has the potential to expand way beyond in the enterprise. Because obviously it does things that everybody wants. It acts as a single source of truth. It unifies data. It's an easy tool to be used as well. So you don't need to be a very skilled data scientist to be using and operating a CDP. So it has some really good features by itself. But I think that what it also triggers is that it forces the company to put their self in order or their data in order. So it helps the CMO or the CDMO just go to their colleagues, ask for help or support or enablement or funds, right? because you're right. If the data is not good in the first place, the even marketing is going to have a hard time just using it. So I think it's a really good trigger, or is a really good excuse to provoke those discussions and conversations, but also to provoke the actual work on the ground in companies around data readiness.
Mhm. So I want to thank you so much, Ghadi, for joining me today. I really have enjoyed our conversation.
Same here, Kelly. Thank you very much for your perspective on the business, the great conversation, and your thoughtfulness and thoroughness in asking and preparing those questions. So thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
Absolutely. So, and you can also visit cdomagazine.tech for additional interviews.